Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the vast Pacific. The date was June 3, 1942, and the combined fleet was steaming toward what he believed would be the decisive victory that would bring America to its knees. Yet deep in his admiral's heart, a shadow of doubt lingered, a prescient fear that would prove tragically accurate within days. The Japanese war machine had been unstoppable since December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, each victory had fed the Imperial Navy's growing arrogance. But Yamamoto, the Harvard-educated strategist who had reluctantly planned Pearl Harbor, understood something his subordinates refused to acknowledge. America's industrial might would eventually overwhelm Japan, unless the Pacific Fleet was completely destroyed. His plan for Midway Atoll was characteristically complex, involving multiple fleet movements across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese would strike the Aleutian Islands as a diversion, then assault Midway with overwhelming force. When the American Pacific Fleet sailed out to defend their strategic outpost, Yamamoto's main battle fleet would annihilate them in decisive surface combat. It was, on paper, a masterpiece of naval strategy. But the plan's very complexity revealed the fatal flaw in Japanese military thinking: their inability to adapt when reality deviated from predetermined scripts. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, exemplified this rigid mindset. His four-fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried the Empire's most experienced pilots, men who had honed their skills in China and perfected their techniques in the opening months of the Pacific War. The Japanese intelligence services had failed catastrophically, believing the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet were still in the South Pacific after the Doolittle raid response operations. They had no idea that Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with decoded Japanese communications, was positioning his entire available fleet Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway in a perfectly positioned ambush. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft roared off the flight decks, their pilots confident in another easy victory. But this confidence, born of 6 months of uninterrupted success, would prove to be their undoing. The rigid Japanese system that had served them so well in the war's opening phase was about to encounter American adaptability, determination, and a crucial advantage they didn't know existed: broken codes. The first phase of the battle was about to begin, and with it, the exposure of Japan's fatal inability to deviate from predetermined plans when circumstances demanded flexibility. Yamamoto's greatest victory was about to become his most devastating defeat, all because his war planners had forgotten the first rule of combat: no plan survives contact with the enemy. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber through the crystal-clear morning sky, his experienced eyes scanning the empty ocean below. It was 10:15 in the morning on June 4, 1942, and Enterprise Air Group 6 was hopelessly lost. Their target, the Japanese carrier fleet, should have been where intelligence predicted. But the Pacific stretched endlessly, in all directions, revealing nothing but whitecaps and disappointment. 300 miles to the southwest, Vice Admiral Nagumo faced the first critical decision that would expose the brittleness of Japanese tactical doctrine. His strike against Midway had returned with disturbing news: the American defenses were stronger than expected, and a second attack would be necessary. Simultaneously, his scout planes reported American ships approaching from the northeast, but the pilot's message was maddeningly incomplete, failing to specify whether carriers were among them. The Japanese system that had conquered half the Pacific now revealed its fundamental weakness. Nagumo's training emphasized rigid adherence to predetermined attack sequences. His bombers, armed with land attack ordnance for the Midway strike, needed rearming with armor-piercing bombs if American ships were approaching. But switching ordnance loads in mid-operation violated standard doctrine, creating chaos on the crowded flight decks of his four carriers. According to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's incredible victory, The Japanese had spent months perfecting their Midway operation plan, but they had never trained for the contingency now facing them: simultaneous threats from land-based defenses and an unexpected carrier force. While Nagumo's crews frantically moved bombs and torpedoes around their hangars, precious minutes ticked away. At 10:22, McCluskey made the decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. Instead of returning to Enterprise with empty bomb racks, he followed his instincts and turned southwest, following a lone Japanese destroyer that seemed to be racing toward something important. That destroyer, the Arashi, had been delayed after dropping depth charges on an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet, knowingly leading 37 American dive bombers directly to their target. The rigidity that paralyzed Japanese decision-making stood in stark contrast to American adaptability. When Hornet's torpedo squadron attacked Nagumo's carriers at 10:20, they were slaughtered by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Not a single torpedo found its target, and only one pilot survived. But their sacrifice drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers virtually defenseless against high-altitude attack. Nagumo, still paralyzed by indecision, finally ordered his strike force to prepare for ship attack just as McCluskey's dive bombers appeared 6 miles above. The Japanese admiral's delay, caused by his system's inability to handle multiple simultaneous threats, had left his carriers in the worst possible position. Flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangars, and no fighter cover at altitude. At 10:26, McCluskey pushed over into his dive, followed by 36 other dauntless bombers. The Japanese carriers, magnificent symbols of imperial power that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, suddenly found themselves naked and vulnerable. The battle that would determine the war's outcome was about to be decided in the space of 5 minutes, not because of superior American equipment or training, but because Japan's rigid military system could not adapt to the chaos of real combat. The morning sun glinted off the wings of Lieutenant Dick Best's Dauntless as he rolled into his dive, the carrier Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. Below him, the pride of the Japanese combined fleet steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed for a strike against the American carriers they had finally located. It was 10:26 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, and the next 5 minutes would determine whether Japan or America would dominate the Pacific. For the next generation. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, finally, having made his decision to attack the American fleet. But his rigid adherence to proper procedures had cost him precious time. Japanese efficiency, legendary throughout the Navy, had been replaced by confusion as ordnance crews struggled to swap land attack bombs for armor-piercing weapons, while keeping their aircraft spotted for immediate launch. The systematic approach that had served Japan so well in previous battles had become a fatal weakness when circumstances demanded rapid adaptation. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck precisely amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among the rearmed aircraft. The blast ignited aviation fuel and ordnance, creating a chain reaction that turned the carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's bombers from Yorktown were diving on the carrier Soryu, achieving similar devastating results. The Japanese response to this catastrophe revealed another critical flaw in their military system: the inability to communicate bad news up the chain of command. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi, his ship blazing from stem to stern, could not bring himself to inform Nagumo that the flagship was doomed. Japanese military culture, which emphasized face-saving and hierarchical respect, prevented accurate damage assessments from reaching decision-makers when they most needed them. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu faced the same cultural paralysis. As his carrier burned around him, he chose ritual suicide rather than the practical step of organizing effective damage control. This adherence to traditional concepts of honor, while personally admirable, reflected the same institutional rigidity that had left the carriers vulnerable in the first place. Only the carrier Hiryu escaped the initial American attack, and her captain, Tomio Kaku, demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that might have saved the Japanese fleet if it had been more widespread. Without waiting for orders from the paralyzed Nagumo, Kaku launched immediate retaliatory strikes against the American carriers. His pilots, among the most experienced in the Japanese Navy, managed to severely damage the Yorktown despite facing determined fighter opposition. But even this tactical success revealed strategic blindness. Japanese pilot reports claimed they had sunk two American carriers when in fact they had only damaged one. The cultural pressure to report positive results, combined with the adrenaline and confusion of combat, created intelligence failures that prevented Japanese commanders from understanding their true situation. As the morning progressed, the burning Japanese carriers became monuments to institutional failure. Kaga exploded and sank, taking with her hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew and maintenance personnel. Soryu followed her to the bottom. Her experienced pilots lost forever to the depths of the Pacific. Akagi, though still afloat, was clearly doomed, forcing Nagumo to transfer his flag to a light cruiser, a humiliating admission of defeat. For the admiral who had struck Pearl Harbor, the 5 minutes from 10:26 to 10:31 had seen the destruction of 3/4 of Japan's premier carrier striking force. But more than ships had been lost. The myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered on the Pacific floor, and with it, any realistic hope of victory in the broader war. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, smoke from his burning sister ships staining the horizon as he contemplated his next move. It was noon on June 4, 1942, and he commanded the last operational Japanese carrier in the Central Pacific. Round him, the rigid command structure that had dominated Japanese military thinking for decades was collapsing. But Kaku represented a different tradition, the samurai spirit that preferred death to surrender. Unlike his colleagues, who had been paralyzed by the morning's disasters, Kaku embodied the kind of tactical flexibility that might have saved the Japanese fleet if it had been more widespread throughout their system. Without waiting for orders from Admiral Nagumo, who remained stunned by the loss of 3 carriers, Kaku had already launched 2 successive strikes against the American fleet. His pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies campaign, had managed to severely damage the carrier Yorktown despite facing overwhelming odds. The cultural dynamics that had crippled Japanese adaptability were playing out dramatically aboard the surviving ships. Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, found himself unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. The same systematic thinking that had made him successful in earlier battles now prevented him from accepting that his carefully laid plans had completely failed. He remained aboard the light cruiser Nagara, effectively paralyzed by the contradiction between his expectations and reality. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, Hiryu's division commander, represented the Japanese Navy's most progressive tactical thinking. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had studied American methods and understood the importance of initiative in carrier warfare. As reports filtered in claiming 2 American carriers had been sunk, Yamaguchi authorized Kaku to prepare a final strike that would, they hoped, complete the destruction of the American fleet. But the intelligence reports were wrong, a failure that illustrated another critical weakness in Japanese military culture. Pilots, trained to report success and reluctant to disappoint their superiors, had overclaimed their victories. What they reported as to sinking carriers was actually one damaged ship, the Yorktown, which American damage control teams were already working to repair. The cultural pressure to deliver good news had created a dangerous disconnect between perception and reality. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Enterprise's dive bombers found Hiryu just as her final strike was launching. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless bombers down through scattered clouds, their target the last symbol of Japanese naval supremacy in the Central Pacific. The attack was swift and decisive for direct hits that turned Hiryu into a blazing wreck. Within minutes, Yamaguchi's response to his flagship's destruction embodied both the nobility and the tragic Inflexibility of the Japanese military system. Rather than focusing on damage control or evacuation procedures, he chose to go down with his ship, viewing survival as incompatible with honor. This decision, while personally courageous, deprived the Japanese Navy of one of its most capable flag officers at a time, when experienced leadership was desperately needed. Captain Kaku made the same choice, remaining aboard Hiryu as she burned. Through the night, before the end, he had demonstrated that individual Japanese officers could adapt and improvise when circumstances demanded it. But these examples of tactical flexibility were isolated exceptions in a system that valued conformity and rigid planning above battlefield adaptation. As darkness fell on June 4, 1942, the last Japanese carrier in the Central Pacific slipped beneath the waves. With her went not just ships and aircraft, but the institutional confidence that had carried Japan through 6 months of uninterrupted victory. The rigid system that had conquered half the Pacific in record time had finally encountered an enemy. Why? It could not overcome its own inability to adapt when reality diverged from the plan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first fragmentary reports of disaster as his main battle fleet steamed through the night of June 4, 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had reluctantly led Japan into war against America, now faced the collapse of his most ambitious strategic gambit aboard the super battleship Yamato, surrounded by the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled by Japan. He contemplated a defeat so complete that it would alter the course of the Pacific War. The reports reaching Yamamoto revealed not just tactical failure, but systemic collapse. All 4 of his fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were gone, along with their irreplaceable air groups. More critically, the institutional arrogance that had driven Japanese planning. Since Pearl Harbor lay shattered on the Pacific floor, the rigid system that had served Japan so well in the war's opening months had proven catastrophically inadequate when confronted with American adaptability and superior intelligence. Yamamoto's staff officers, trained in the same inflexible doctrine that had doomed Nagumo's carriers, struggled to comprehend how their carefully crafted plan had failed so completely. The Midway operation had been rehearsed extensively, with every contingency seemingly anticipated. But the one factor they had never seriously considered was the possibility that American codebreakers had penetrated their communications, turning Japanese precision into predictability. The cultural factors that had contributed to the disaster were becoming apparent. Even as the battle continued, subordinate commanders had been reluctant to report negative developments, creating information delays that prevented timely decision-making. The emphasis on face-saving and hierarchical respect, cornerstones of Japanese military culture, had proven counterproductive in the fluid environment of carrier warfare, where rapid adaptation was essential for survival. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was now serving as an air operations officer, later reflected on the institutional blindness that had characterized Japanese planning. According to his post-war memoirs, referenced in Gordon Prange's Miracle at Midway, the Japanese had become victims of their own early success, assuming that American forces would react predictably to Japanese initiatives. This assumption had made them vulnerable to the kind of tactical surprise that Admiral Nimitz had orchestrated. As dawn broke on June 5th, Yamamoto faced a strategic decision that would test his own ability to adapt to changed circumstances. His surface fleet still possessed overwhelming firepower. The Yamato alone carried 9 18-inch guns that could devastate any American ship within range, but without air cover, his battleships were vulnerable to land-based aircraft from Midway and carrier strikes from the surviving American fleet. The admiral who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months before American industrial power overwhelmed them, now saw his prediction coming true ahead of schedule. The Midway defeat had not just cost ships and aircraft, it had accelerated the timeline for American counteroffensive operations throughout the Pacific. Every experienced pilot lost over the Central Pacific was irreplaceable, while American training programs were already producing new aircrew in unprecedented numbers. Yamamoto's decision to withdraw his remaining forces rather than risk his battleships in a daylight surface action demonstrated the kind of strategic flexibility that had been absent from Japanese planning throughout the operation. But this adaptability came too late to salvage anything meaningful from the disaster. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed irrevocably to the Americans, and Japan's rigid military system would struggle to regain it. The retreat from Midway marked more than a tactical defeat. It represented the beginning of Japan's long decline toward ultimate surrender. The institutional weaknesses exposed during those 4 days in June would continue to plague Japanese military performance throughout the remainder of the war, as their system proved incapable of the kind of fundamental adaptation necessary for victory against an increasingly powerful and confident enemy. The hospital corridors of Yokosuka Naval Base echoed with the whispered conversations of senior staff officers as they attempted to assess the true magnitude of the Midway disaster. It was June 10, 1942, and the surviving participants in Japan's greatest naval defeat were beginning to arrive home. But the institutional culture that had contributed to their failure was already working to obscure the lessons that might have been learned from the catastrophe. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda lay in his hospital bed, recovering from appendicitis that had prevented him from flying at Midway. As he listened to eyewitness accounts from the pilots who had survived the battle, their stories revealed a pattern of systematic failure that went far beyond individual mistakes or bad luck. The rigid planning system that had characterized Japanese military operations since the Meiji Restoration had finally encountered circumstances that exposed its fundamental weaknesses. The cultural prohibition against bearing bad news had created a cascade of intelligence failures that prevented Japanese commanders from understanding their true situation throughout the battle. Pilots reported sinking American carriers that were actually only damaged, while damage control officers hesitated to inform their superiors about the true extent of fires aboard their own ships. This institutional reluctance to acknowledge negative realities had turned tactical setbacks into strategic disasters. Vice Admiral Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor who had commanded the carrier strike force at Midway, found himself subjected to subtle but unmistakable criticism from his subordinates and superiors alike. The same rigid hierarchical system that had elevated him to command now demanded that someone bear responsibility for the defeat. But the real causes of failure, institutional inflexibility, cultural blind spots, and strategic overconfidence were too systemic to be addressed through individual scapegoating. The Japanese Navy's response to the Midway defeat illustrated another critical weakness in their institutional structure: the inability to conduct honest self-assessment. Official reports minimized Japanese losses while exaggerating American casualties, creating a false narrative that prevented meaningful reform. The same cultural factors that had contributed to the battle's loss now prevented Japan from learning from its mistakes. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the true extent of the disaster by Admiral Nagano, asked pointed questions about how such a carefully planned operation could have failed so completely. But even at the highest levels of government, the institutional pressure to maintain face prevented complete honesty about the systemic problems that had been exposed. The rigid thinking that had characterized Japanese military planning since the 19th century remained largely unchanged despite its catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz was conducting the kind of thorough after-action analysis that Japanese culture made impossible. American officers openly discussed their mistakes and near disasters, identifying lessons that would improve performance in future operations. This institutional willingness to acknowledge failure and adapt accordingly would prove crucial as the Pacific War entered its next phase. The contrast between American and Japanese institutional responses to Midway reflected deeper cultural differences that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. While Japanese officers were encouraged to maintain harmony and avoid criticism of their superiors, American military culture emphasized problem-solving and continuous improvement. These different approaches to institutional learning would compound over time, giving American forces an increasing advantage as the war progressed. Captain Fukuda, as he recovered from his illness, began to understand that Midway represented more than a tactical defeat. The battle had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese military thinking that would be difficult to correct without challenging the cultural assumptions that underpinned their entire system. But such challenges were virtually impossible within the constraints of Japanese institutional hierarchy, ensuring that the same mistakes would be repeated in future engagements. The price of institutional blindness was becoming apparent. Japan had lost not just for carriers and their air groups, but the strategic initiative that had carried them through 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the observation deck of his flagship as the combined fleet approached home waters in mid-June 1942. The architect of Japan's greatest naval victories now bore responsibility for its most catastrophic defeat, and he understood better than anyone the broader implications of what had occurred at Midway. The rigid system he had tried to reform from within had finally revealed its fatal limitations, and the window for Japanese victory in the Pacific War was closing with alarming speed. The statistical reality of Japan's losses at Midway told only part of the story. For fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft and more than 3,000 personnel represented irreplaceable assets in a nation with limited industrial capacity. But the institutional damage was even more severe. The myth of Japanese invincibility that had sustained morale since Pearl Harbor lay shattered, replaced by growing awareness that American industrial power would eventually overwhelm even the most skillful Japanese tactics. The post-battle investigations that followed Midway revealed the same institutional problems that had caused the defeat in the first place. Senior officers were reluctant to criticize their subordinates, while junior officers hesitated to identify systemic problems that might embarrass their superiors. The rigid hierarchical structure that had served Japan during its period of rapid modernization now prevented the kind of honest self-assessment necessary for military reform. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, spent weeks interviewing survivors and analyzing intelligence reports in an attempt to understand how their seemingly perfect plan had failed so completely. His conclusions, documented in classified reports that would not surface until after the war, identified the same institutional rigidity that Yamamoto had warned against for years. But even Genda's analysis was constrained by cultural expectations that prevented him from directly challenging the system's fundamental assumptions. The broader strategic implications of Midway became apparent as American forces began their first offensive operations in the Solomon Islands. Japanese responses to these new threats revealed the same inflexibility that had doomed their carriers in the Central Pacific, unable to adapt their doctrine to changing circumstances. Japanese commanders repeatedly fell into the same patterns of rigid planning and inadequate tactical response that had characterized the Midway operation. Yamamoto himself would fall victim to the system's failures less than a year later, when American cryptographers intercepted and decoded his travel itinerary, allowing P-38 fighters to shoot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The same intelligence superiority that had made Midway possible continued to give American forces crucial advantages throughout the Pacific theater, while Japanese security procedures remained unchanged despite their proven inadequacy. The institutional lessons of Midway were never fully absorbed by the Japanese military hierarchy. The same cultural factors that prevented honest assessment of the defeat face saving, hierarchical deference, and resistance to systemic change continued to plague Japanese military performance throughout the remainder of the war. Each subsequent defeat followed similar patterns: rigid planning, inadequate adaptation to changing circumstances, and institutional inability to learn from failure. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, the rigid system that had initially served Japanese expansion so well had become the primary obstacle to effective resistance. The flexibility and adaptability that characterized American military culture had proven superior to Japanese institutional discipline, demonstrating that rigidity, however admirable in appearance, could not substitute for the ability to learn and change. The Battle of Midway thus stands as more than a tactical victory for American arms. It represents the triumph of institutional adaptability over rigid systematization. Yamamoto's warnings about the limitations of Japanese military culture had proven prophetic. But by the time those limitations became apparent, it was too late to implement the fundamental reforms that might have changed the war's outcome. The rigid system that had carried Japan to early victories had become the instrument of its ultimate defeat.